Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks to everyone for coming to the last session before the closing keynote, of course. It's nice seeing that there are still so many people coming to this last session. Thanks you so much for that. Did you enjoy NDC London so far? Great, that's nice to hear. I hope you also enjoy my lesson and session, and then you can move on to the closing keynote by Randall. And so welcome to my talk, which is called 82 Bugs I Collected in a Year You Won't Believe Made It to Production. And before I begin with my talk, I actually have to admit something to you. The title is a lie. I'm really sorry I have to tell you, but I didn't collect 82 bugs. What happened is I collected 158 bugs. So I'm so sorry about that. I hope you're really not mad at me for that. So yeah. So actually also a year is also not quite correct. It's more like 2 years, but more on that a little bit later. But it wouldn't be a talk about bugs without some bugs in the title as well, right? So let me first introduce myself. My name is Francois, and I work at the company Karakun. We are a company that develops software for customers, and we also do consulting. And we have offices in Germany, Switzerland, and I'm also an active member of the Swiss Testing Board, where I'm also a member of the ISTQB working group of advanced and expert level. And there I am one of the authors, for example, of the test analyst syllabus and the security test analyst syllabus, which are both coming soon. And by the way, you can see there's a QR code in the top right. Don't worry, it will be on almost every slide coming forward. You can scan it if you want to get the slides and the recording. You just put your email address in the form, and then I will send them to you straight to your mailbox. So, I am a bug collector, and well, sorry, this was not supposed to be here. Not these kinds of bugs. The bugs that I'm talking about are those kinds of bugs. Especially the last one is killing me because I can tell you I've seen this so many times with my name. And if I got a pound each time this happened, then I would be rich now. So just to start off, a little bit of some disclaimers. So first, it's not about bashing of any companies. So I tried to anonymize some of the screenshots a little bit. But of course, if you put in enough effort, I'm sure you will be able to de-anonymize some of them. It's really tricky to make sure I still, keep the original bug without changing it too much, so that, it won't be recognizable anymore. So, any, similarities are just coincidences. And, I didn't develop these apps, so what I'm doing is I'm kind of guessing just based on my experience where they came from or how they could happen. But I feel like this was quite, possible for me in most of the cases, so I don't think this should affect it too much, just, for you to keep in mind. And also, if I say a bug in the UI or UI bugs, then what I mean by that is that I suspect the code is most likely written in the front end where the bug comes from. But of course, you never know. It could be some logic that was done in the backend as well. So, just keep this in mind going forward. And then lastly, or almost lastly, the platforms that I used were mainly Android and macOS, and I also used iPadOS, as you've probably seen in the earlier screenshots, and also Windows, but not as much as the first two. And then this time, really lastly, most were found by me, but a handful of them were sent to me by other people. As soon as I was talking to people about it and telling them about it, they were like, oh, I found this bug as well, here you go, take this. And yeah, this was obviously very nice of them, but most of them were found by me. It's really just a small amount. And I think 1 or 2 examples are some that, were really getting very popular on social media and so on, but they were recent, so, at least they were in about the same time frame. So at first the question is, what is a bug, or what counts as a bug towards this talk, right? So, the closest definition I could find was the ISTQB glossary definition, which is, for defect, which is probably the closest you could find. And so it says an imperfection or deficiency in a work product where it does not meet its requirements or specifications or impairs its intended use. Of course, since I don't know what the requirements and the specifications of these applications are, the impairs its intended use is the part that I will be focusing on, at least what I consider to be the intended use. Of course, that could also be something I got wrong, but I think that should be pretty obvious. So, and then also to tell you about some of the bugs I set myself for what counts as a bug. And that was on the first, it was that I only counted unique bugs. So if they appeared later, which definitely did, so they were not fixed, for example, then I didn't count them again if it was the exact same bug. If there is an error, they only count if the error exposes information that it shouldn't, because of course you don't want that. Or they provide no instructions on what you should do. As you can see in this example, error while loading the consignments, it's like, well, what should I do now? And otherwise, it's if the instructions exist, but they don't work. Like in this example, you can see here, if you click on talk to support or on refresh, it actually just leads you to the same page. So yeah, this doesn't really help you. So this is one of the cases where I really recommend you, if you do a similar page, then make sure you either put an email there or something like that so that people could contact you in some way, even if the page is broken. Because, of course, if something is broken and doesn't work, how can you assume that the support page works, right? So this is the case where I counted it, but if it led me to a support page and I could contact them, I didn't count it. And another example would be something like this, where, if I tried again, and here I even gave them one shot more and then tried it a little bit later, even though it didn't say that. If it still didn't fix itself, then I count this as a bug too. And then the reproducibility didn't matter. Of course, since there were so many bugs, I didn't have the time to try out if each of those, like, are they reproducible as well and track that. So I, didn't take care about that. But I think it shouldn't matter for this talk. I mean, since it happened in the first place, it's still something we need to fix because they shouldn't even make it to production in the first place, right? And then I didn't count any bugs that were in websites or apps that I contributed to. Well, whether this is just to avoid bias or because my apps that I develop have a lot of bugs, it's up to you to decide. And let's have a look at some statistics first. So the first one would be the amount of bugs I found per month. So you can see I mentioned, it wasn't technically in a year. You can see there were a lot less in 2023. And this is because I was only, let's say, becoming a serious bug collector from the January of 2024. Before I, just did it sometimes when I saw a bug. What I did was I just screenshotted it and then I took the bug and then, categorized it and so on. This is what I did. And I really meticulously started doing this from the 1st of January. So of 2024, so that's why actually. And you can see there were quite a lot in August. I don't know why, I checked my calendar and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so it just seems to be a coincidence that there were so many. And you can see that the number of bugs were always like around at least 5 bugs and then a little bit more, a little bit less sometimes. And with one exception being the June. And also, by the way, I found 124 bugs in 2024 alone. So, maybe if we let the title be in a year, it should be 124 bugs I collected. But, the number doesn't really matter. And then let's get to the different types of bugs I found. And I'm curious to hear what you think. So, does somebody have any idea, like, what do you think is the most common kind of bug that I found? Any ideas? Yes?
Oops, something went wrong.
Oops, something went wrong. Okay, good guess. Another guess?
500?
500 error? Okay. Well, that could be an option as well, yeah. Let's see. Someone else? Okay, let me show it to you. So by the way, I grouped it into types and subtypes. This is the type. And here you can see most of the bugs were from the UI, which in a way didn't really surprise me because, at least in my experience, the UI is rarely tested really well, which kind of explains maybe a little bit why the amount of bugs in the UI were so high. I feel like this really shows us that maybe we should put more focus on the testing of our UIs, at least doing some component tests or something like that, so that we can get rid of those bugs. And you can see, 73 is really a lot bigger by a huge margin compared to the other bugs. And logic is mostly bugs that are affecting the backend. And then, internationalization bugs, they are also, sometimes in the backend, sometimes in the front end, however we want to count it. So I put it separately. And then error handling, data, encoding, data validation, and so on. AI here refers to, if the AI did something or exposed something it shouldn't. Maybe you've quickly seen it in the beginning. For example, it was like revealing parts of its instructions in some of the thinking that it was doing. So, this would be something that would count. So, the 500 was mentioned, or the oops, it was not found. This is something that would be reflected in the subtypes. So let's look at them. So, by the way, I only put here the top 15 because else it would be pretty much unreadable on a slide because I had 40 subtypes in total, so quite a lot of them. And you can see I was kind of surprised the responsiveness was so high here. I don't know if you were, I would say. And the next one would be unresolved templating, string formatting, text keys, and so on. We'll get into most of these. Just to give you a brief, a brief introduction to some of them. For the text keys, this means that the text keys were visible, and actually here, they had to either be persistently visible for me to count them as a bug, or they had to either be shown at least long enough for me to take a screenshot. I mean, I'm not the fastest person at taking a screenshot, but still, sometimes it happens that the text key shows up, and then suddenly it loads the internationalization local files from the backend, and then it shows it up a little bit later. And I was always also kind of surprised that calculation was so high. This affected all of the things that were something that had to be calculated. And I kind of thought that we had figured out how to write unit tests in the backend already. But it seems like this is not really the case. So make sure for that to make sure that you write enough unit tests in your backend to get that figured out. And then also this translation thing that I put here, this is kind of like a placeholder because the full thing didn't really fit because I had to kind of lump multiple things together because it didn't really make sense to separate them. This is kind of short for a missing translation with a fallback to English or an incorrect language or inconsistent language because it was also difficult to tell, from my perspective, which of those causes it actually was. And also when it mentions here blocked without resolution, where there were 4 bugs, this means that I had, for example, an error. As you've seen this, oops, there's an error where I could not go to support. So you'd see at least, in the cases where I had something, like a 500 or 400 or whatever, there were just 4 of those cases, so it was not really that much of that. At least I feel like most people are doing a great job at that nowadays, where they link to like a support page or something like that that just happened to work, of course. I rarely saw an email, I have to say, though, which I would prefer personally, but that's just a matter of taste. But apart from the count of bugs, what counts just as much, maybe if not more, is how severe were those bugs. And to do that, I wrote down a flowchart. If you don't have something like that at work, I really recommend you to do something like that. Or you can also you can scan the QR code and then get the slides, and you can feel free to use this either verbatim or use this in any adapted form. Do it yourself, adapt it for your use case. But this is really useful because it makes the judgment of the severity consistent, and it enables if you are in a team with multiple people, which most of you probably are, then this enables you to have the same kind of severity for each of the bugs, and this really makes it clear. However, what I did for this talk was I didn't really look at the differences between major, minor, and trivial, because of course, since I found so many bugs, I kind of had to limit it somewhere. Of course, I couldn't show you 152 bugs in this entire talk. So what I did was I judged the severity between blocker, critical, and then below critical. Because I feel like there were more than enough blocker and critical things that I could talk to you about, so that it wouldn't really make sense to differentiate between the others. So just keep this in mind. So let's have a look at the statistics if we take this into consideration. So you can see that the slash pattern shows that something is a blocker. If it's like a double-hatched pattern, then this means that it's critical, and then the white is just a below critical bug. And you can see that if we look at the statistics again now, we can see the UI is of course the one with the most bugs in general. But if you look at the ratio between the most critical and blocker bugs in comparison to all of the bugs that I found per category, you can see that the error handling and the logic comparatively, also the data validation, the data, they had much more severe bugs than the UI. So still, while we should make sure to do more testing in the front end, which I think is definitely necessary, this kind of shows to us that maybe it makes more sense to focus more on the error handling and the logic and data validation and data categories, just to make sure, because we really, we don't want to, we want to prevent bugs from going to production in the first place, but if they go to production, at least we would like them not to be severe if we could choose. So let's go, if we look at the subtypes here. Here I didn't separate between blocker and critical, since there were not that many criticals, most of them were blockers if they were. And you can see there are quite a lot of subtypes, and here it's also kind of different if we look at the numbers. So here it's the highest percentage of critical and blocker bugs per subtype. So you see the subtypes with 100%, they were the ones where every bug I found was either critical or blocker, which there were quite a lot of actually. And we will be getting into those a little bit later on and how we can fix them. But just to mention some things that don't really make sense mentioning on their own. The flicker that you can see here, this is something you really should be mindful of, because I found this, I think, at least 2 or 3 times. And this is something we really need to be mindful of, because flicker could cause people with epilepsy to have an epileptic attack. And we don't want to have that. It could be a real risk to people. And we really want to avoid those kinds of bugs for that. So, really, it's difficult to detect and difficult to test for, but if you see them or if you get reports of them, please keep the people with epilepsy in mind and, try to fix it as soon as you can. And also another one is the incorrect default behavior, which is like something like the user seeing a placeholder text, like was the case, as you've seen, maybe there was a web page where it showed like lorem ipsum and so on. I would expect if something is not present to show something like coming soon or something like that. So this is this category essentially. So let's have a look at responsiveness, since we have seen there were so many bugs in responsiveness. So you can see on the right we have here an example of a website on mobile. Probably some of you know this website, even though I didn't put the name here. You can see here, if I go to more models, it doesn't show me more models. It doesn't show me which ones these are, and I can't click on them. I can't choose them. So, in my opinion, this is a bug that is blocking, but of course you could argue that the more models are not really that relevant. Mostly, of course, they want you to use the best models that they show you here. But still, in my opinion, this kind of shows really nicely how, at first when I saw that responsiveness was so high, I was initially expecting, because I forgot about this bug, that there weren't any really severe cases. I was like, oh, probably there are just a lot of them, but not really severe ones. But this is, I think, a really good case that shows how responsiveness can be blocking. And, it's maybe just a coincidence that here the more models was, the part that is least important maybe here, that is not working. It's possible that they did test for responsiveness just with the other models. Of course, we don't know. If you know more details about any of those bugs, by the way, let me know afterwards. I'm glad to know to be able to improve the talk even more. But yeah, so how can we fix this issue? So first, this is something I was assuming everybody was doing, but apparently this is not the case. Mobile first design, or sometimes it's called mobile first development, where when you develop something or you make a design of something, you first start with a mobile, canvas. You try to first design it where it's on a smaller screen, and then you try to scale up from there, because usually if you start with mobile and then try to scale up from there, it's easier and usually more possible than doing the other way around. So this is something I would definitely recommend. By the way, each of those things that are underlined, they are a link. So if you're curious to learn more about those techniques or things I show you, if they're underlined, again, scan the QR code, and then you can, click on it as soon as you got the slides. And then another one would be to implement end-to-end testing on mobile devices. So here you can use, for example, frameworks like WebDriver.io, which allow you to test on simulators, emulators, or even real mobile devices. So this is something I would recommend you to do, especially if you have a lot of mobile users. Here it really makes sense. If you have analytics in place, look at your analytics, check how many of your users are using mobile. If I don't know, maybe 80% are using mobile, which is usually the case. I mean, nowadays, a lot of people don't even have a computer anymore. I mean, of course, we as software developers are probably not really, those kinds of people. But if you think about, I don't know, your mom, your sister, or just a friend of yours that's not, a developer, most probably they don't even really have a computer anymore. They have a phone, maybe a tablet, something like that. Most of the things you can nowadays do really well on those platforms. So I feel like this becomes more and more relevant. And you can alternatively also use Playwright, which you can use to emulate mobile platforms. But here, I really recommend you to do this only if you are using Playwright already, just because this is a simple way to add this kind of testing to your testings already, just by, adding a few lines of code to also add this emulation as one of the tests you're running. If you don't have end-to-end tests yet and you do a lot of mobile things, I would really recommend you to do it with WebDriver.io or some other framework that allows you to do this. This is my preferred framework for that. So yeah, that's how you can fix the responsiveness, of course, because you can then this way detect that it's not clickable, so you would be able to see, I need to fix this. But most likely, I really try to recommend you to try to go with the mobile first design or the mobile first development first, because of course, if you fix it from the get-go by getting it right, from the beginning, it's still better than having tests. But still, having both is probably the best. But if you need to limit your time, I would say try to focus it on the mobile first design, or try starting with that first, if it's possible. And then the next one that you can that we found that happened quite a lot was the unresolved templating. So here it's about having placeholders that are not replaced, as you can see in this bug here. So you can see I was kind of frustrated because I wanted to look if I am able to, take or book this hotel, because I, needed like a reception that was open until the time where I arrived with my flight, which was quite late. And this actually was a bug. This would also be something I would consider to be a blocker, because I actually didn't book this hotel because I was not able to find out how long the reception is open. So, this kind of cost them a customer just by having this bug in the website. And I think this is something we really need to keep in mind when we design those websites. Something that may seem as benign as this could cause someone to, not book your hotel or whatever, not use your services, and this way you lose a customer, which is really bad, of course. And then another one is this one, which I've had in an email. So, of course, this can happen in emails as well. The top screenshot is from a website, by the way. So I feel like that's also something you shouldn't underestimate. You should test this with email templates as well, of course. And that's where I get to my first point. You should just implement unit or integration testing to see if the mechanism where you replace something, if it works, and make sure you test this in every place that you do some replacement. And you don't have to do this in a way where you test if the replaced value is actually what you put in. I think it would be enough, even if you have, let's say you have a generic mechanism that you have written, some logic to replace this. you could just have a test that runs all of the replacements against all of the text you have, and then it just checks, do any of the placeholders appear in your code? And if there are no placeholders anymore, then great, it worked. So this is an easy way on how you can test this, without a lot of effort and without having to maintain those tests too much over the time, but still being able to find those kinds of things. And make sure, of course, to also test the edge cases. I think that's something I noticed quite a lot. A lot of the edge cases, a lot of the bugs that I found were edge cases. Well, it depends on what you consider to be an edge case. Like, to me, having no value is not really like an edge case, but fine, I could understand that. Very long value, of course, that's maybe a bit of an edge case, but still you need to keep this in mind. Maybe if someone has like a name, some people have like, I don't know, 6, 7 names, and then it can become very long. And if you put this into an email, then it could maybe look quite messy or on the website and maybe mess up your layout in some cases. And then, of course, test immunity of 8 characters. I'm kind of advocating for it, to get my name fixed in all of those applications, of course. So yeah, make sure to use some of them. My name is really useful for that, to try it out. I always say, like, I accidentally test all of the websites with my name, even though I don't really want to, but it's fine. Yeah. So let's go to the next bug, which is string formatting. And here it's the text that is not really adjusted depending on the input. So on the right, you can see in this screenshot, I was searching for my space way, not my plus way. I mean, probably it was encoded this way to be able to pass it to the backend, but still, you shouldn't then use this, what you pass to the backend, to show in your front end. And then another thing I counted under string formatting was, number of guests, 2 guests. I mean, this is a small thing, but I feel like it's kind of unprofessional. It doesn't give like a good impression. I could understand if you rarely have more than 1, but most of the time you will have more than 1 guest if you have guests or something like that. So yeah, make sure to take care of that. And one of them is, again, unit integration testing. And then another one, especially to handle all of those edge cases, you can also use this for the previous bug, by the way. You can do parameterized testing or data-driven testing, where you pass in a lot of different parameters and see with different cases, like with 0 guests, 1 guest, 2 guests, and so on, if it works or not. And then you have to also beware if you have internationalization in place, where I have to say, most of those bugs that I found, I had a look at if they supported internationalization or not, because I was kind of curious. And most of them were actually in cases where you used internationalization, which of course makes this harder. But I have to say, still there were some cases like this number of guests thing, which was on a website that just had 1 language. So I feel like, really there's no excuse for that, especially if you're doing it like that. Just keep in mind, if you do internationalization, it's really difficult if you don't know that many different languages. Some languages do, not use the same kind of logic. Maybe they use the same, ending for 0 as they use for 1, or maybe they use the same for everything, or maybe something different for every single one. Just keep this in mind while you're implementing this. And then, of course, test the edge cases again. Kind of it comes down to this. It's very similar to the previous one, of course. Now let's get to the text keys. So I'm sure every one of you has seen this before, right? I mean, raise your hand. Who of you has seen this before? Okay. It's not as much as I would have expected, but still, let's say around half or a quarter of the audience. So you can see here, in this case, the bug is that there is a text key that gets shown, like in this case here, blue light filter disclaimer, which should be replaced by text, of course. And you can imagine, especially if usually those bugs aren't as severe. I mean, it really depends if the user can kind of deduce from the text what is supposed to be there. But especially in case of a disclaimer, this could lead you into legal trouble, of course. So make sure, especially if you do some kind of testing of test keys or whatever, try to focus on those that are the most crucial, or if they wouldn't work, would have the highest risk to your business. Like in this case, disclaimers must work, else, you could, the user could say, I didn't see a disclaimer, it just said disclaimer, but there wasn't one. So, if you would get sued, of course. And then again, unit integration testing. Same as again here, test your logic where you insert a string, depending of if you use your own logic or if you use a library, it's like an integration or a unit test, of course. And then you can use libraries like, for example, in JavaScript, you can use i18next, which is a library you can use to configure to log a warning when a text key is not translated. The link leads you to the configuration page. I really recommend you turn it on. And then what I usually do is I use this in conjunction with component tests, where I use a plugin, which I also linked here, which makes tests fail if there are any warnings in the console, which is in general a good idea, by the way. I mean, because sometimes there are warnings about deprecations or things like this, and this kind of gets you to, get rid of them, which is also another useful side benefit of that. But of course, this requires good test coverage, which you need to really ensure, because if you don't have test coverage somewhere, then you won't discover that there's a warning there. So, but still, it's better than nothing if you just have it in a few places, as I mentioned. If you don't have this testing in place at all at your company, then maybe try with the most critical parts of your application if you use internationalization. And then there's something that we call flashing of text keys, which is like, intermittently showing the text key as it is and then showing the real text afterwards. And this is something that happens quite a lot if someone is on a slow connection. And usually it's not detected because if you're developing locally on your machines or if you're testing it in acceptance testing at the company, usually people don't try to see, in Chrome, for example, you can, in the developer tools, you can slow down the internet, if you didn't know that before. And then you can try, for example, cases like this where you can simulate having a bad internet connection. But most people don't do this. But the way you can prevent this, the best way would be to use something that is called server-side rendering. You can see here an example with i18next in the link. If you render it already into the page that you give to the front end and to the client that visits your website, then of course you'd have no flashing of the text keys. But if you load asynchronously the text keys, then of course this doesn't work. But if you use server-side rendering, or if you already use something like Next.js or some other library that already implements server-side rendering natively, it's usually quite easy to change over to that. And another option is if you have to asynchronously load it, consider putting something like a skeleton screen there. You can see there's a small image of what I mean by skeleton screen, because maybe the term isn't as known to every one of you. In the skeleton screen, this thing, you show it while you're loading a website. I'm sure most of you have probably seen this before while using some websites. And you can show this while the internationalization files aren't loaded yet by the client. And then as soon as the files are there, you can hide it again. And this way you can prevent this flashing. I mean, it's a small little detail, but still I feel like, it gives, kind of the edge of showing that you know how you do your stuff well. Then let's go to the next one, unfiltered error message. I'm pretty sure most of you have seen something like this. Who of you has seen this in production? I'm curious. Okay, so about half, maybe almost everyone of the audience, so I'm not surprised about that. So, in general, it depends on the message. This one is an exceptionally bad example, I would say, because here, these black squares I put in, those are censored data just because, this exposes information about the company or their internals that I, of course, don't want to expose here. Just keep in mind, this could be a security issue too. However, it doesn't always have to be. It could be something that is as simple as that. I mean, if you're developing or selling a product that is marketed towards developers, then this is, of course, fine to a certain degree. I mean, it's still nicer if you have a nice message. I mean, reading regexes especially, I mean, this one is kind of okay, it's simple enough, but especially if you have a more complex regex, then this could become a bit of an issue. But, in general, most people are probably not developers that are using those websites. I mean, coupons, for example, as in this case, are mostly on just web stores that everyone uses. And this is not nice. in this case, the bug is to essentially just show what is generated by the framework or the library that you're using. And this can also be a usability issue, as it is here with the coupon, of course. And then I really recommend you to turn off the stack trace in the UI in production. Probably most of you are doing this already. But also I would recommend you to check this, because you can never be sure. I experienced before where I thought I turned it off, but then I think we were using Apache. It's not specific to Apache, just this was an example where I noticed it. To rewrite some of the URLs, and then it was just one layer, in front which the user accessed, and there we didn't disable it. We disabled it for the other web server, and then we noticed, we had to disable it there as well. So keep that in mind if you have multiple layers, to check in every layer as well if that happens or not. And then in production, I generally recommend you to only show explicit errors that are returned from the backend. Otherwise just show some generic error message, because then you don't risk leaking some information that you don't want to leak. Like, for example, a message could be, an unexpected error occurred, please try again, or contact whatever email address if the issue persists, or something like that. That's what I usually do. Especially in applications that are critical, but even in not as critical applications, I would still recommend you to do this. It just makes your life easier. And just in cases where you explicitly return an error from the backend, then show this. And also ideally, of course, don't return anything to the front end from the backend that has an error, because still you could just look that up in the network tab of your browser. So don't return it from your backend in the first place. Maybe return this message from the backend instead, or something like that. And then this is not strictly necessary, but I really recommend you to add some alerting every time there's an error, of course, one that isn't like a validation error or something like that. When something in the backend or in the front end happens, because if you do it this way, then you can, usually when you try to reproduce it, you will be able to tell, especially if you reproduce it under like, production-like circumstances, then you will be able to tell, does it show you the error, as you expected it, in a way that it shows exactly the error, or does it show like a stack trace you don't want to, for example? Just because, from my experience, and probably most of you have the same experience, I would guess, users, in most cases, they don't report bugs back unless they are really severe or they're really blocking them, they cannot continue, as long as you are linking to a support page that works, of course. So, yeah. And then the next one is kind of related to it in a bit. It's unfiltered debug information. So as you can see here in the screenshot, I was shown here a update SQL statement. So of course you don't want to show that to users. It's just a guess by me in this case that this is debug information. I can't know for sure, of course, right? But I couldn't explain to me how this could be happening here. So definitely, the first one would be, make sure you turn off any debug flags for production. Ideally, I would really recommend you to even make it impossible to use debug flags. So maybe don't even just put it into like a variables file. Maybe on a code level, do this already, where you say like, if environment is production, then do not allow any debug flags to be active. Then you really make sure that nobody could accidentally activate the debug flag in production because they were like, I thought, I just activated it for 1 minute, it's fine. Well, it depends on the application. Usually, it may be fine if it's not too big of a website, but please don't do this. But if you must, then please use feature flags where you enable this for specific users, and of course, test that it only shows it for specific users in those cases. And just because this could be a symptom of like something like an SQL injection, which also points us to cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. Of course, make sure that you prevent those because you don't want to enable any users to be able to make use of that, where a query is shown that they get more information that they could then abuse in a SQL injection attack that they perform. And here I have links to some cheat sheets by OWASP on how you can prevent them. And then the next one is incorrect or missing information. So you can see here, it's either the case that there was some economic problem in Switzerland or in Japan, else I couldn't imagine why the currency exchange changed from 0.6 to 0.0058 in just one day. This doesn't make sense at all. And especially, in finance applications, this can be quite bad. And this also reminds me of a bug where I experienced a weather API I was using, for a personal project of mine, where sometimes I got, I suddenly saw like in my graph like a huge spike that went up to 999 million, whatever, kilometers per hour winds. So, I hope there wasn't a hurricane that was as severe as this. Of course, those are usually, it's usually bad data, and, you need to filter that out. So essentially here, what you want to do is, if you enter the data in manually, I really recommend you to implement like a 4I principle. So like when you enter data, someone else has to approve it, for example, because then the chance is lower that you make like typos. I don't think that's what happened here, but this could be a source that results in this. And then what also could be one is that you should add validations in case the data is significantly different from the data you've previously been getting. So, if somebody enters, let's say, 0.0058 instead of 0.6, maybe you should show the user like, are you sure you didn't mistype here? If, of course, you expect the data to be somewhat consistent in some range. If it's, if it's able to spike, then you can't really do that, of course. But whenever possible, this really helps because, even, to train support users, this happens. And if you fetch data from an API, which would be my guess is what happened here, then, especially when you are in a finance or some other critical environment, make sure that you perform some plausibility checks on the data you get. And if you get any unexpected data, I would, first, of course, send an email to someone, let them know that, this happened so that they can fix it. And also, you can consider to, for example, show the old data and then show like an explicit notice like, please note the data is outdated, it's from this date or whatever. Or, depending on the behavior, if you don't want to show old data, if this is not acceptable in your use case, you could also just show an error message and say like, I'm sorry, we are currently, experiencing issues, please try again later or something like that. And then the next one is actually the first and only bug where I can't show you the actual bug for, reasons that will become obvious to you now. So you can see here, for example, I'm sure most of you have seen something like that before, where when you use some kind of search engine or, some kind of online store, it shows you like, the most popular searches or something like that. And here you need to keep in mind, what happened in this case. By the way, the image on the bottom right is just a symbolic image, just for you to understand the point. This isn't the actual website or the actual bug that happened. It happened on a different page, but I won't name it here because it doesn't really matter. But you can see here are some of the trending searches it shows as soon as I click in. But the problem is this is something that comes from user input data. And as soon as you hear user input data, you can imagine the problem is you should never trust any user input data. You should always assume that any user input is unsafe and malicious. I'm pretty sure most of you will know this. And you should not trust it. So, how these algorithms work, usually they just see what searches are made by users frequently in the last whatever period that you configure, and then they show the most trending searches. But of course, this would allow malicious users to just write a bot and spam your endpoint with lots of different requests for one specific search term. And this could result in some bad words being included, as was here the case in my bug that I experienced, where one of the recommended search terms was a bad word that you shouldn't have on your website. And so this can be quite bad. And this is thankfully something I've known before because I was already building at my company, for one of the customers a search solution. And I remember we were discussing in the team how we could prevent this in the best way because this is kind of a tough problem to solve. And like a safer approach that I would suggest to you would be to, let's say, if you have a product search, you could try to only suggest things that are in your product database itself, because then at least as long as you have some governance over the data and you know that the data is trusted in a way and it doesn't contain any bad words in terms of the products that you don't want to show, then this is fine. But you have to keep in mind, one reason we didn't do this in our implementation was because it could potentially allow some companies to push their products if they would just spam the endpoint with their products searched. Because then people would click on it and they would see, oh, this is this product, and they would click on it, and then maybe they would get more sales. Which, if you have like a search engine that is across multiple different vendors and things like this, you want to prevent them, accusing you of, having manipulated data in your website. And then what is kind of the best approach, but also the most, time-intensive one, is to have like an allow list of trending searches. So you just define like an allow list in your database or something, or like with a UI you can specify where you can explicitly approve or deny certain search terms that can be shown in the trending searches. As I mentioned, this of course has the disadvantage that on the one hand you can't have trending searches react too quickly, except if you have like someone that like if you have people working shifts to do this, which probably is not worth it in most cases, I think. You maybe lag 1 day behind usually in terms of the trending searches. If this is acceptable, or you tend to kind of have the same kind of trending searches all the time, this is totally fine. But of course, if you need to be on the bleeding edge of knowing what is a trend and be able to promote that, then of course this isn't an option for you. One way that could maybe help is maybe AI to judge if it's something that's appropriate or not. But of course, this is also vulnerable to prompt injection. So yeah, you kind of have to pick your poison here. I don't know of a more ideal solution here. If let me know afterwards. I'm really I'm interested in knowing it. And by the way, I mentioned here data poisoning. I didn't explicitly see that in my in my tests that I did. Data poisoning is usually, where you have a compromise of a machine learning or AI training data set, where it's compromised by some adversary, to intentionally, make an AI worse, for example. And this is a very similar thing that could happen to the case that you have here. So just remember to keep this in mind as well. Like when you're building a product where you use AI and you train, a machine learning data set, a machine learning algorithm with some training data, or some AI things, then keep this in mind that this could happen to you as well, and you should try to prevent that. So, and then I'm already at the end of my talk, and by the way, I have one last gift for you. So I am just about to finish an ebook that I'm writing, and if you scan this QR code, it's the same as on the other slides, so if you scanned it already, you're fine. I will send you this ebook. It's on how you can prevent flaky tests, and I'm sure most of you will probably have had a flaky test at some point. I'm curious, who of you has had a flaky test before? Okay, those are most of you. So, yeah, that's something that happens a lot, and this is what motivated me to write it. So it gives you some tips on how you can prevent that, and you will get it for free if you scan this QR code and enter here. Yeah, so now I'll open up for questions. Yeah, thank you.
You're very big on testing, right?
Yes.
What strategies do you think would have prevented those bugs that you were showing?
Okay, thank you for the question. So the question was, you are big on testing, was the first one, which is why I laughed. And then he said, like, what strategies could have maybe prevented most of those bugs that I've shown? Is that right?
Yeah.
So one thing I didn't mention, but I think is very powerful, is exploratory testing. So exploratory testing is a technique where you especially take someone or multiple people that have a lot of domain knowledge in your product, and you get them to just, like in a session, usually you define a topic, which is maybe, for example, I don't know, data validation, and then you try to break the app in just any kind of way that results in some data validation errors or something like that. The focus can be different depending on the topic that you choose, of course. But if you then do these exploratory testing sessions, you just go through the app, not really randomly. I mean, of course, you go through it with some kind of system, but usually you tend to find some bugs there that you don't find in other ways. So this is something I find quite useful to do. So really, if you don't do this yet, then I really recommend you give it a try. Does that help you out?
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Any other questions? Okay, so it seems like not. So in this case, I will still stay here in case you have some more questions. You can approach me, let me know. Also give me some feedback. This is the first time I've done this talk. I really appreciate any feedbacks I can, so I can improve the talk to make it even better. And thanks you so much, as I said again, for coming here in the last session. It's nice to see so many people be here, and I hope you enjoyed it.